Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very beautiful May day. So we're here to listen to two brilliant speakers. They are the Anne Ray interns at the ARC here at SAR. The first speaker is going to be Samantha Tracy. Felicia Garcia. Sorry, allergies. You can always blame everything on allergies. That's why I like Santa Fe. So the title of her talk is called You're on Indian Land, Next Steps for the Implementation of Meaningful Land Acknowledgement Protocols in Western Cultural Institutions. Felicia Garcia is Samala Chumash and holds an MA in Museum Studies from NYU. Felicia is also interned at the Guggenheim Museum in NYC and the Smithsonian Museum also in New York City. She's also interned at El Museo del Barrio, Hallie Ford Museum of Art in Oregon. And with the full support of her community's education department, her ultimate goal is to return to her community and work in education and programming for the future museum and cultural center. So as you can tell by this quick resume, she has a lot of experiences, has been in different parts of what we know today as the US. So please help me welcome Felicia Garcia. Thanks.
All right. Can you hear me? All right. Haku, hello. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral land of the Tewa peoples, Ogapoge Owinge, or White Shell Water Place. I invite you all to join me in paying respect to the elders of both the past and present, as well as living descendants and the future generations who will continue to maintain connections to the land on which we are gathered today. Okay, so as Gio mentioned, the very lengthy title of my talk is You're on Indian Land, Next Steps for the the Implementation of Meaningful Land Acknowledgement Protocols in Western Cultural Institutions. And it's a part 2 to my master's thesis, which I completed last year at New York University, and is titled You're on Indian Land, Making the Case for Indigenous Land Acknowledgement in Mainstream U.S. Museums. So I'll explain a little bit later why I chose to slightly change the title to my talk. Also, before I begin, I just want to be clear about the fact that I don't claim to speak for Indigenous people, I don't speak for the Native people of the so-called United States, and I don't even speak for my own community. This work has been written from my individual perspective, which has been shaped by my community and culture, as well as an education in mainstream Western institutions. So during my time here at SAR, I have continued to work on my thesis, so to start, I'll try to give a very brief overview of that work. Sorry, let me start my timer so I know where I'm at. Okay. So the main argument of my thesis was that Indigenous land acknowledgement should become commonplace in mainstream museum institutions as a step towards reparation for the harm caused by over a century of misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples and the denial of the right to participate in the telling of their own narratives, despite the fact that these institutions act as the stewards of vast amounts of Indigenous material culture. In my thesis, I argued that these acknowledgement statements represent respect for Indigenous voices, acknowledgement of the dark truths of U.S. history, and demonstrate that Indigenous peoples are still here to tell their own stories. As I'm sure many of you know, but for those who might be less familiar, an Indigenous land acknowledgement is a statement that recognizes the Indigenous peoples who have an ancestral connection to the land on which a meeting or event takes place. The first statement that I gave at the beginning of my talk is an example of this type of statement. While this practice traditionally has taken a verbal form, I argue that museums should also adopt permanent versions in the form of either a text panel or plaque due to the ephemerality of verbal statements. And just a quick note about terminology. While the practice of Indigenous land acknowledgement is new to museum institutions, it has long been an established protocol among Indigenous populations all over the world. It has even made it into mainstream society in both Canada and Australia. There is no single definitive term that is used to describe this statement. In Australia, it is officially known as an acknowledgement of country when given by a non-Aboriginal person, and a welcome to country when given by an Aboriginal person. While in Canada, there is not an officially recognized term, it is generally described as a traditional territory acknowledgement. For the sake of my thesis, I made the decision to use land acknowledgement to refer to a United States context rather than territory acknowledgement. Although it might make sense to use the same terminology as Canada for continuity, since both countries exist in the so-called North America, I use the word territory, or the use of the word territory might be misleading within a United States context. So to prevent confusion with the 16 US territories, I decided to substitute the word land. So there are many critiques of this practice, some of which you may have heard of and I'll get into a little bit later in the talk, but I believe land acknowledgements are a manifestation of survivance. To me, these statements have the potential to acknowledge the strength and resilience of Indigenous communities, and to acknowledge that despite concerted efforts to wipe out Indigenous peoples through violence, dispossession, forced assimilation, and economic destabilization, these people survived. They are still here, and they will still be here in the future. Okay, just some background images. So in my thesis, I argued that museums and any institutions that took part in the salvage collecting of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are uniquely responsible for the adaptation of Indigenous land acknowledgements. Many museums are erected on land that is essential to the identity and worldview of Indigenous peoples. Yet the truth about colonization, displacement, and the devastating effect of forced relocation that forced relocation has had on Native American communities is not frequently discussed in historical narratives or within the walls of museums. And because these stories are left out, many people are not even aware of the existence of local Indigenous communities. There are over 560 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and that doesn't include those that are state recognized and those that go unrecognized. And at most, the average person can maybe name 5 to 10 of these tribes, which I think is a pretty generous estimate. I argue that through their predatory collecting practices and the display of objects to represent entire groups of people, museums played a role in colonization and the development of popular historical narratives, which have left out many voices and difficult truths, thereby causing great harm to Indigenous peoples. Therefore, it is the obligation of these institutions to make reparations by using their power to rewrite mainstream historical narratives and give voice to the groups that have been excluded. I believe that one very small but tangible way that museums can start to move in that direction is by acknowledging the communities that have an inseparable connection to the land on which they reside. Additionally, museums and collecting institutions have perpetuated ideologies related to manifest destiny, terra nullius, and Western notions of private property. This has proven to be harmful because museums are perceived to be objective temples of knowledge within our society. Therefore, to me, there is no doubt that museum representations of Indigenous peoples and U.S. mythology have contributed to policies and practices that have negatively affected Indigenous peoples. Some might say that this is history. However, the current examples of Standing Rock, Bears Ears, and Chaco Canyon demonstrate that these ideologies continue to persist in contemporary struggles around the recognition of Native territory. In my thesis, I argued that as educational institutions, it is the ethical obligation of museums to create truthful and factual representations. Though land acknowledgements might seem like a very small step, I believe that since these institutions seem to remain stagnant, it is a necessary first step that will ideally lead to more significant commitments to decolonial practices. During my research for my thesis, I had the opportunity to speak with several museum professionals, and one of the most significant conversations that I had was with Dina Dart, who is also Chumash and a former SAR scholar. This particular quote from her really stood out to me. She said, "For museums to stop doing harm is the first step, and right now, currently, many of them are continuing to do harm. These acknowledgements are a first step that compel museums to recognize that harm." So I submitted my thesis last May, but I also wanted to create a resource that would be more accessible than a 75-page paper. It was my hope that my thesis project would be something that would lead to the actual implementation of new protocols in museums. It was my vision to create an easily digestible but informative guide to Indigenous land acknowledgement that would only take up a single sheet of paper. So over the summer and during my first few months at SAR, I continued to work on this guide in collaboration with my advisor from NYU, Dr. Jane Anderson, as well as several other individuals who have been doing similar work in Lenape-Hoking long before I began my thesis. I did not anticipate how difficult it would be to condense so much information into 2 pages, but after several drafts and rounds of feedback, we officially published our guide on Indigenous Peoples Day last October. I was at the annual meeting for the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums during that time, so I was also able to distribute the guide in person to individuals who were in attendance at the conference. Ultimately, we decided to use both land and territory, and also to broaden the guide to apply to all cultural institutions beyond museums, such as libraries, universities, archives, etc. This is why I selected the term cultural institution instead of museum in the new title of my talk. So this is the guide here, and I have a couple of hard copies here if you're interested in looking at, but there's also a website, which I will talk about in a minute. Just briefly, I wanted to let you know what the different sections of the guide are, in case you can't see it. It was meant to be sort of a general FAQ to land acknowledgement. So there's a section called, "What is an Indigenous land or territorial acknowledgement? Why are Indigenous land and territorial acknowledgements important? Why cultural institutions?" And then a section for suggestions for creating your land or territorial acknowledgement. And lastly, there is a resources section. And I just wanted to read to you in the suggestions for creating your land acknowledgement section, we included an example. And then in the blank spot where you can insert the community, I'll just use Tewa. So it says, "We are gathered on the unceded land of the Tewa peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Tewa community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations." Then you can say the name of your institution. "Also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism." And if you look at the guide, we tried to make it really clear that this can be a really good starting point, but that every institution should try to be really sincere and genuine and generate their own acknowledgement. And then I also just wanted to acknowledge in the resources section, I made it a point to include a link to the U.S. Department of Art and Culture's On Our Native Land Guide, which came out in October of 2017. I think it's important to pay respect to all of the work that was done before this guide and really set a precedent for my thesis. Okay, so this is the website. We wanted to make this really easy to distribute. So we created a website, landacknowledgements.org, and you can download a PDF copy there. We also included an expanded resources section with clickable links on the right side. Again, we felt like it was really important to recognize the existing scholarship and the work that my thesis was built upon. And you will also see that the SAR guidelines for community collaboration are listed in the resources section. So here's a little graphic that shows the number of site visits and visitors. The number of visits is higher. That one is the blue line because a lot of the same visitors have used the site more than once. As of April 18th of this year, we had 2,891 visitors and 9,961 visits, which I am really proud of, and those figures don't include all of the individuals that we've reached with physical copies of the resource. I'm not really sure why there is a spike on February 10th, but my guess is that someone shared it on Twitter. So when I came to Santa Fe, originally it was my plan to research the reach of the guide during my internship here at SAR. I was really curious about our audience. What constituencies are represented by those 2,891 visitors? I felt that this research could help us to figure out who we were not reaching and maybe come up with a strategy to broaden the reach. I thought the best approach would be to design a survey to distribute through relevant listservs and social media to get a sense of who is using the guide and what they believe could be improved. However, as I worked on designing the survey, I realized that the classic survey format and typical survey questions reinforce colonial hierarchies and dichotomies related to identity, such as age, race, gender, and that kind of categorization really seemed to be in opposition to the work that I was trying to accomplish with the guide. In recent years, there has been a big push to decolonize research and data and reframe the way that quantitative information is collected and interpreted. We perceive certain research methods to be objective because they are empirical and deal with quantitative data, but they are actually based in subjective Western epistemologies. And I don't really want to get too much into that because several scholars have written books on this subject, such as Maori scholar Linda Tuiwai-Smith, so you can, I can give you those resources if you're interested. So as of right now, I'm trying to rethink the survey approach, and I'm working with my advisor from NYU to reframe our questions in a decolonial way, if that's even possible. Because I do think it's important to understand who our audience is, but that's something that I'm going to continue to work on during my time, or after my time here at SAR. So to substitute this survey research, I decided to have a conversation with one of the IARC docents who came up to me a few months ago seeking advice on the use of land acknowledgements in her volunteer work. I decided that for the time being, these types of personal conversations could provide useful qualitative information about the guide. And it is my plan to continue to gather these little vignettes from individuals who have interacted with the guide until I develop a more satisfactory survey method. So I just wanted to share some useful information that I gleaned from my conversation with my docent friend. So first of all, she told me that she feels that land acknowledgements can be a good jumping off point for people who have little knowledge of Indigenous issues. And she thinks that this protocol could easily be incorporated into the docent training programs at any type of museum, not just those with Indigenous collections. So those 2 points represented a really big success for me because they speak to explicit goals of the guide. She also said that she feels that the guide could be made into a pamphlet or some format that is less academic but also still official, which was a little disappointing to me because I really hoped to make this guide accessible, but I think after looking at it, there still is a lot of academic jargon, and so I'm going to continue to work on that. She also specifically commented on the last line of the acknowledgement example, which states, "This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism." She felt like that including a line like this in an acknowledgement could be really intimidating to cultural institutions. Which brings me to the next phase of the work for this project. So during my research over the last few months, I've come up with a lot more questions than answers. And I really want to make it clear that land acknowledgements themselves are not decolonizing. Implementing an acknowledgement protocol at an institution is not the end-all, be-all solution. Rather, it is a verbal commitment to the implementation of decolonial practices that will begin to address the legacies of settler colonialism. It is meant to create a sense of institutional accountability. These acknowledgements have become more popular among museums and other cultural institutions in the United States over the last year, but the acknowledgements have actually been continuing harm in a lot of cases, and I can speak to this personally because I've experienced it. Oftentimes, institutions and individuals have looked to Indigenous peoples to create their acknowledgement statements. This is not meaningful collaboration when Indigenous peoples are not compensated for their work as consultants. In fact, it devalues the intellectual contributions of Indigenous people. I have found that oftentimes institutions assume that the acknowledgement in itself is payment. Further, it demonstrates a continued disinterest in actually learning about Indigenous communities among settlers who are unwilling to do the work. These statements benefit the institution or individual by giving the illusion of interest in Indigenous issues, but they do not represent meaningful change. And that's why I emphasize the word meaningful in my new title. So the next question that I seek to address in this work, which you'll see here, is how do we correct the labor imbalance created by the expectation that Indigenous peoples write acknowledgement scripts for non-Indigenous people to read? And then the other main question that I'm focusing on currently relates to the issue that my docent friend brought up about institutional commitment. How can we make that commitment less intimidating? Or what are some concrete, actionable measures that cultural institutions, specifically museums, could take that represent an interest in dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism? This is an image from Dene artist Dimian Yazi's Instagram, which I feel does a really good job summarizing the sentiment behind the direction of my research. Let me see, I'll read it, I have it here. So the post says, to all institutions practicing land acknowledgements, tell us, what steps do you do to hold space and center Indigenous peoples? How are you actively working to pay Indigenous people, donate to Indigenous causes, protect Indigenous land and water rights, and promote Indigenous sovereignty? So this post also demonstrates that while I came to these questions organically as a result of my experience with the guide, many individuals are thinking about these same questions. I don't have the answers to the questions yet. I have some ideas, but I would like to hear from individuals that work in cultural institutions about what they believe is feasible. So the next phase of the project will be to host a problem-solving session / roundtable discussion at an upcoming conference to crowdsource ideas. We need various levels of action that can be taken to address these questions. I think we need a range of solutions because budgets vary and institutional willingness to support these sorts of initiatives also varies. Currently, I'm collaborating with 2 of my colleagues from NYU who have similar research interests, and we are working on a proposal for the Council for Museum Anthropology Conference, which will be held in Santa Fe this upcoming September. So hopefully our proposal will be accepted, and maybe you'll be able to attend our forthcoming session. We are hoping to translate the information that we gather into an op-ed piece for an online news source, and then eventually an expanded guide. In conclusion, there is a lot of work left to be done and a lot of questions left to be answered. So keep an eye out for progress on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia. That was a very incredible talk and obviously very important work that you're leaving us with a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts. But thank you for that talk. It was really good. So for our next speaker, we have Samantha Tracy, who is Dene and received her BFA in Museum Studies from the Institute of American Indian Arts, IAIA. Samantha's extensive museum experience includes internships at the IAIA Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, or MOCNA, and the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. Samantha was also exhibitions preparatory assistant at MOCNA, student curatorial program mentor and curatorial assistant at the Ralph T. Coe Center for the Arts, and most recently the Registrar Art Prep for Estili Fine Arts Services, all in Santa Fe here in New Mexico. Samantha looks forward in pursuing a career in collections management. The title of her talk is Digital Collections, Including Native American Community Voices in Online Museum and Research Projects. So please give her a hand as we welcome her to give her talk.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Gio. And I just want to say, it was a really great talk by Felicia, and, just, working with her and being a part of this internship with her and getting to learn from her as well with her project that she's doing has been very meaningful. So, Yad She Samantha Tracy Inishia, as a Lana Nishla, Kiani Bashichin, not Odine, Tachini Dashiche, Taban Dashnelle, a good Aga Dine Stan Nishla. So my time here at the IRC, gave me some time to work on a research project. And in the beginning of my research project, I proposed to work with tribal museums in terms of digitizing some of their collections. So with that, I definitely found a lot more interesting things that came across that. So for my research presentation, it includes my interest in museum databases. Databases are the heart of the museum institutions and any space that holds objects to record inventory for researchers or curatorial-based projects. As a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts, with my BFA in Museum Studies, my focus has generally been on collections management. While a student, I worked in the MOCNA Collection Storage, which is housed on the IAIA campus. This is where I worked with my first database. It was very intimidating at first, with the thoughts of accidentally deleting something or crashing the program. It took me a couple months to figure out what information went where to find artists, and also experiencing the bugs and technical difficulties that came along with it. Being able to work with a program that every museum includes within their institution was an interest that I didn't think I would appreciate. After obtaining my degree, I volunteered at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, where I was a research assistant helping renovate their permanent exhibition. My job consisted of reading and gathering information that would be helpful or included within sections of this exhibition. With this, I also got to work with their database. This was a whole new program that I was unfamiliar with. I thought every museum worked with the same database, so I felt very confident and that would be easy to manage. Before searching for things and getting familiar with this database, my supervisor, she gave me a heads up and that there are actually culturally sensitive and funerary materials that are listed. Knowing this put caution to what I was searching for. I didn't want to come across any information or images of what I know are sensitive to my traditions and culture. Although there was no really way to avoid what was there, so finishing up with my volunteer time at MIAC, I found a job that also included working with databases, but this time with private collectors. Upon working with the database, information ran general, since it was just a record of what was being stored in the facility. During this time, I started volunteering at the Ralph T. Coe Center for the Arts and began working with their database, which consists of personal notes on each object that Ralph Coe collected for his collection. My task included updating condition reports and locations of objects. Working with 4 different databases, which included contemporary native art, anthropological and ethnographic materials, and personal collections, filled my interest in how cultural objects are documented and represented. Databases can be generated to be published online for further research without having to visit the actual museum, which makes it accessible by giving it a virtual platform. So with this presentation, I decided not to do any slideshows, but just have a conversation about the things that concerned me in my research, and just talk about what I've been doing and how it's definitely an ongoing process of learning more about how I could learn from this, but also implement it into communities. So, like I mentioned, my first presentation, I wanted to help tribal museums digitize their collections, and just give them that platform if they wanted to. So, when I was involved with looking at this research, I delved in deeply into researching what museums' collections look like online. So, and that was just, took me into this different wormhole of finding new information, and it was just, it was really scattered, but within my findings, I began my research viewing museum websites to look at their online collections to see what information they had about cultural objects. Many were actually good about not posting any sensitive material, which I found, very interesting. But it wasn't until I began looking at universities. When I began looking at different universities, a number of them did display funerary objects that should not be viewable, which were members' bowls and a funerary staff, which the image was not published, which was really good. But just coming across these different case studies within universities that I learned from when I was a student at IA, it seemed very problematic with universities in terms of not reaching out to community members and just having what they have within their collections and thinking it's fine to put online. But in reality, you definitely have to have that community input and consultation within the tribes that represented of those objects. So it was, like I said, it was really interesting to find that I didn't really find too much sensitive stuff out there. So that was done. And then so I started diving deeper into what tribal museums look like. So I was looking up tribal museums online to see, if they were actually putting things online, and if so, what. I was surprised and impressed that some tribal museums had strict protocols for research request applications. These restrictions give community members full rights to accept or decline what researchers are going to be looking at and what they're going to do with that information. So a few of the tribal museums that I came across, they were pretty good because, we definitely know what is sensitive to us. We know what should and shouldn't be shown within these online platforms. And there was this one web portal, which was a collaboration between shared tribal nations and reservations in the Washington State area. And that portal is called the Plateau People's Web Portal. And like I said, it's a collaborated platform that's between these tribal nations and reservations, and the materials in the portal have been chosen and curated by tribal representatives. So I thought that was really impressive that they had their full access and their full, commitment of creating this database for their wider audience, but keeping in mind their own community, their own voices, their own objects that they know that should be displayed. So within one of their categories, they called it a path. And within that category, it allowed viewers to directly access materials from one tribe. And as a matter of sovereignty and respect, each tribal path follows protocols of the tribes. It allows for tribal curation of materials and defined access based on cultural values. And another example of this tribal museum search that I was doing, another one was the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, their archives and records section. They were really strict, which I thought was really cool, because they had researchers that wanted to come in and look at their archives and records. They had to submit 5 documents for this research permit application, and they were the research permit app, a research regulation ordinance process, a Chapter 66 research regulation, and a Resolution 1981-721, and a Resolution 1990 317. So those were just looking at all those and seeing that all this information that these researchers want to search for, it has to go through them, and it has to go through all these different levels of acceptance. And I feel like that definitely gives us as tribal people the more power to protect what we have and what we say. So those two were really good examples of my findings. So after looking at tribal museums, toward my previous job before becoming an intern here, like I mentioned, I was working with private collectors and their collections. And what really struck me about the place that I was working at, a lot of the times, the pieces that were coming in were from auction houses. And nothing that came in was really sensitive, but just the thought of having these pieces come in from auctions interests me in sort of looking at what auction houses had described of pieces that they're selling. So auction houses have been in the headlines for auctioning off culturally sensitive and ceremonial objects without the consent of tribal communities. When situations occur in this way, it generates the conversation of where, how, and who obtain these culturally significant objects. So with that in mind, I looked at a few of the auction houses here in town, but it definitely, to look further into what they had, you had to do a membership. And that kind of struck me, like, what do I have to provide? Like, what kind of information are they wanting? Like, I don't want to get in trouble, and like, what is this person doing? Like, this Native girl looking at our websites and stuff. So it kind of struck me, so I didn't sign up for the membership. It kind of like drove me away, but they did thankfully have, well, not thankfully, but they did have like catalogs of their past sales. So that was an interesting factor of getting to look at what sold and what they had and the provenance behind everything. So a lot of times it was a lot of questionable material, a lot of questionable objects that I found on there, and just seeing that they had a price tag was just something that definitely would turn an Indigenous person away, or had their questions about how they obtained these pieces and who it's going to afterwards. So that was another loophole that took me into auction houses. So after that, I went to go look up local galleries here in town. Since I'm a community member of Santa Fe now, got my New Mexico license. But so that I felt like, being here for such a long period of time and being within this museum field, I never thought of really looking at galleries. I did, always walked by, but that was pretty much it, and, just didn't want to really look at any of the things that they had. But this was an experience. I had a personal experience going to one of the galleries, and that was here in town. I think they relocated, but when I went there to go visit, they had like a lot of South American artifacts and just objects of all sorts, and they were very questionable. They just, totally looked really old, and they just didn't seem right in that place. And they definitely had high price tags, and that was just something that totally threw me off. And so I decided to look up where they were, if they were still located in town. And they do have a website, and I didn't see anything that had Native American artifacts within their categories, but there was this one. So I was kind of glad that I didn't see anything on there. But one of the categories was other. So I went to go look at it, clicked on other, and sure enough, this piece of natural rock that was obviously chiseled out was posted as a pictograph, or it is a pictograph, for sale with the description of being an Asazi within the years of 1200 and 1315 AD. So it has all that information on there, and it definitely made me think of, NAGPRA, the Graves and Repatriation Act, and, how that seemed very illegal to have this piece that was culturally tied to these peoples, these ancient peoples, and to be able to see it within that website, to be able to see that, you can inquire about purchasing it, was just totally wrong. And yeah, that was that. And there was another gallery here in town. Actually, my boyfriend went there, and he was telling me that he was looking around, going around, and I've been there before but didn't see this. And he was telling me that within their bathroom, they had a members bowl. And it's just that's obviously they're thinking that's decorative art. And it's just those terminologies as well that, definitely strikes me as doing this research and being part of this museum field, that, not all Indigenous art is decorative. And it was just crazy to think, that it was actually in the bathroom, and it just being disrespectful to what this piece actually is, which is a funerary piece because it had a kill hole in it. So that was totally, just misplaced, and just totally threw me off, and didn't want to actually go into that gallery. But, me knowing that this is wrong, I should have to say something, but we'll see what happens with that. And so not only did I search within tribal museums and galleries and auction houses that are incorporating digital collections from their facility online, but I also got very thankful to experience it during my time here at the IRC. And they are a perfect and leading example of working with communities to include their voices and knowledge into what is going to be accessed online. The IRC had the best database that I have worked with because they are adding community knowledge and information. And with this experience, I got to sit in on one of their community visits with the tribe, with the pueblo that they're working with now. And it was different in terms of the group that came in were all councilmen. And they definitely seemed, they had their questions, but, being involved with that, the IRC staff definitely made them feel comfortable and, had these questions for them, but vice versa, the councilmen had questions for them. And, they just really worked well with terms of communicating and wanting to build this relationship with them in terms of what is okay to be shown within their database, their e-museum that they're working on now. But also, restrictions on certain things and what we have in the collection that, shouldn't be shown or anything. So it was a good experience to sit in with that, seeing that these relationships can be built, this trust can be built. And that was just a really proud moment for me to be able to sit in on that and see that they're really, really, really working to work with these communities. And so with all these different loops and wormholes that I went through, this research has definitely, is definitely going to be ongoing for me. And I'm just glad that I definitely took the steps in looking at all these different online platforms that could possibly have information about pieces. So being able to examine these different online collections has been an interesting experience in hopes of figuring out a solution for facilities that hold sensitive and non-sensitive material and making them accessible online. Creating guidelines for collaboration with communities would be a start. Collaboration takes time and commitment to build the trust to make a better change. And the IRC has a really good example of their guidelines, their members' guidelines, community guidelines that definitely I would like to, take and just build upon that as well, but, with my own concerns for my tribal community members that I would want to go back and work with. So I hope to take it from it and build upon the best way to work with communities. And the visual and or virtual representation of an Indigenous perspective and input is just as important as what archaeologists and researchers have been acclaimed for and have written about these cultures. We are in a time of change and improvement, and with more and more Indigenous scholars entering the field, we have the power to include our community voice within databases and build better relationships with these institutions, based on a mutual understanding and willingness to learn from one another. Having meaningful community input is key to building that relationship. So with all this research, like I said, it's just definitely ongoing, and I'm definitely going to run into some, problems that I have to solve and would want to work with community members to fix those concerns that they have. Because within my field of study and learning all these databases and being able to experience that information that goes within it, and then doing this research and looking at these online platforms has definitely inspired me to continue to do something about this. And in all regards to the galleries, auction houses that I've looked at, it definitely made me feel like I was having this conversation with my boyfriend, and he was saying, you just have to be a NAGPRA police. We have to go in and, actually do something about it, because sometimes, NAGPRA does have this long process of wanting to repatriate or do something about these cultural institutions. So with another, actually, I forgot to mention, after I went to auction houses and galleries, I went to eBay. I looked up eBay and I stopped right there because I saw that someone posted that they were selling eagle feathers, and that is totally illegal. And, it's just we can't, as Native people can't get away from any of those kind of things, having these people sell and treat our objects the way that they do. And, it's just really unfortunate that I had to come across everything, but it definitely sparked an interest in me that I wanted to pursue taking care of this in some way, some form or another. So, this research has definitely helped me, learn from all that. So, that's pretty much what I had for my presentation. And I'm really hoping that, like I said, I could do something about this, because within my field, and being an Indigenous person and seeing these catalogs online has definitely, we need our voice to be included with these. We need to have those community connections and build relationships. And this just goes back to, Felicia's presentation of land acknowledgements. I mean, if a museum or institution is going to put that within their protocols or their intros, then, they should work with communities. So, this is definitely a great research project that I have been doing, and I really hope to go further onto it. So, thank you very much, Ikehet. Thank you for all for being here and letting me speak about this. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I think we have time for questions, if y'all have any thing y'all want to ask. Or